Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and over in the patch 11.1 PTR, we're seeing some last minute class changes with a bunch of buffs and nerfs almost all across the board. A variety of different classes and specs are receiving some crucial adjustments, and with how many players are still trying to figure out which classes they're going to main, I thought it's worth going over all of these changes to make sure that your choice is as informed as it can be. To keep this video as short as I can, because it is a long one, I do have chapter marks down below, so if you just want to skip around to the most relevant classes that you had an interest in, potentially maining 11.1, you could do so, or if you want to watch the entire thing, that also works for me. As always, if you guys want to get more regular updates as soon as 11.1 goes live, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Starting out with the class of Death Knight, both specs of Frost and Unholy are not receiving detailed changes, but rather just a 5% damage buff all across the board. Frost is just a damage buff for all of your abilities. For Unholy, it's a buff not only for your abilities, but also pet damage by 5%, which is really good, especially for pet specs, because sometimes they'll just buff your damage, but your pet isn't part of your damage, even though it feels like it's part of you. So it's good that they actually have a buff for both of these specs, which at the very least are not changing too much, but hopefully will be tuned relatively okay, and hopefully somewhat competitive, because they've been so far fun in Season 1, and hopefully they'll continue to be somewhat fun in Season 2. Then we have the class of Demon Hunter, where they're not really changing up Vengeance or Havoc, they're kind of changing up Eldrazi, mostly with bug fixes, which may result in a handful of nerfs. Now, Eldrazi playstyle is not even a lot of players' favorite. Most players naturally gravitated towards Felskard before they found out the Felskard was the more optimal option. Eldrazi has a unique mechanic with its Reaver's Glaive that gives you combo-based abilities, and it wasn't everyone's favorite, but it is looking like it's probably going to be the more competitive seasonal choice. At least it was looking like that so far over these past few weeks on the PTR. And the Eldrazi also started up with a couple of bugs that caused it to do way too much damage, and I heard that a lot of these bugs have been fixed, but I am not sure if this new set of fixes is those recent ones that we talked about just now, like all those ones that cause it to do way too much damage, or if this is just another layer of fixes. But they apparently fixed an issue with Wounded Quarry, which is doing incredibly good cleave damage in dungeons. I'm not sure if I do have the damage up, but yeah, it was doing insanely good in dungeons, especially as Havoc, but also pretty good as Vengeance, and apparently it was double dipping in Thrill of the Fight's damage bonus plus the Mastery of Demonic Presence, which is the Havoc Demon Hunter's mastery that increases all chaos damage by a set amount. And they also apparently changed up the Art of the Glaive or Reaver's Glaive ability, prevented it from double dipping into Thrill of the Fight. So I guess it's yet another change that is going to have an impact in terms of its overall performance. Like I said before, Eldrazi was looking like a very strong choice, and likely a secured choice for Season 2, like everybody was gonna look like they was gonna be playing it, which might have, with these fixes and these issues, I might have skewed the numbers to help Eldrazi look better than it really was. Be very careful when picking up a Demon Hunter for Season 2 and looking at some of the early sim numbers, as these changes to fixes is likely going to adjust how Eldrazi functions and its overall performance. That being said, for Havoc, ever since they took out Any Means Necessary, I don't really know if you're going to go back to Felskard, since it does fire damage, not chaos damage, so it doesn't have the same scaling as before when Any Means Necessary was a talent. So Eldrazi may still be a viable choice going forward, but may not be as ahead as it was over in PTR. When it comes to Druids, we're seeing two new changes, one for Feral Druid and one for Guardian Druid. With Feral Druid, we're seeing a very slight damage buff of 25% more auto attack damage. Now, auto attacks is not the biggest damage component for every single melee. For a good portion of them, it is a solid bit, but for Feral, it's just a raw damage increase for pure single target, and makes stats like haste slightly better, but not super consequential. They also wanted to buff up the actual raw damage of Adaptive Swarm. Not the damage amp that it does, but the raw damage of the ability, the nature damage that it does, to be 25% more effective, which is fine, but you for the most part would use Adaptive Swarm as a kind of an add-on towards your bleed damage and impacting it as much as possible. The tier set option, or specifically the tier set bonus called the Big Winner Streak, the actual Big Winner component has also been buffed up by 40%. which it looks like it's actually part of the 4 set instead of the 2 set, but the 2 set basically allows you abilities to increase your winning streak as a buff, which increases the damage of your Rip, Bite, and Primal Wrath by 3%, stacking up to 10 times, and all those finishers, Rip, Bite, and Primal Wrath, have a chance to remove it. Free Ferocious Bites are exempt from this chance to proc. When you do consume Apex Predator's proc, you become big winner, dealing now 1.2 million physical damage to Apex Predator's primary target, and increasing the damage of your periodic effects by 16%, which hopefully should be a fairly consequential tier set bonus. When it comes to Guardian Druid, they're buffing up all of your ability damage by 5%, and they're also impacting or increasing the effectiveness of your Moonfire damage by 20%. On top of it, Elune's Chosen Fury of Elune damage, which you can only proc from the Light of the Lune, that damage is buffed up by 80%, so it looks like they're kind of trying to give bears an opportunity to head into the Elune's Chosen pathway and go back to the Moon Bear based gameplay, or at least potentially go in that direction in Season 2. When it comes to the Evoker, we got some brand new nerfs for augmentation, which a lot of any of you that are playing or were planning to play Aug are probably not excited, but literally everybody else in the community is super happy about this change, or for the most part a large portion of the community, because Aug was looking like a mandatory pick for Mythic Plus, raiding, and just about everywhere, and looks like they're noticed that, yeah, everybody's running it, they're very popular, let's try to make them less mandatory going forward. So we got a variety of different nerfs, from the mastery versatility that you can provide to your allies. That versatility has been reduced by 20%, which is going to be a sizable nerf. Breath of Eons will now accumulate only 8% of ability damage from your allies instead of 10, so not the biggest nerf, but it is going to have some group functionality reductions with that. Also, the passive Close as Clutch Mage, which allows augmentation to be more effective in dungeons and smaller groups, like 2v2, 3v3 groups, maybe 5-man content. Outside of raids, augmentation were initially going to be increasing the effectiveness of the Ebomite and Breath of Eons by 25%. That is now being downclocked to 10%. Initially, they didn't have this buff in the game for a good portion of Dragonflight, but they brought it back in to War Within in preparation for Season 2 content, when they decided that augmentation was no longer going to buff the healer or the tanks of any party. Whether you're in a 5-man content or in a raid, couldn't buff up any tanks or healers at all with major buffing abilities like Ebb and Might. So, because they decided to make him a class that only buffs up the other DPS classes, they brought in Closest Clutch Mage to amp up that effectiveness, but it looks like they're bringing that down quite a bit. So that's a fairly sizable change of set of nerfs for augmentation, which hopefully will make them at least less mandatory. I don't think anybody wants augmentation to be like the worst DPS in the game. They just don't want it to be literally rank 1 for yet another season in a row for Mythic Plus, so hopefully they'll have something more sane, allowing other classes to shine a little bit brighter. As for Devastation, however, which sometimes feels like it plays very much second fiddle to augmentation, they did get a little bit of a buff. All ability and spell damage can increase by 6%, which is a nice increase. Though the tier set is not going to be as effective, where previously the tier set would launch random procs of Shattering Star, or whenever you press your major cooldown ability of Dragon Rage, you would also shoot Shattering Stars. All of these Shattering Stars can no longer proc Essence Burst, so it is going to adjust a little bit how you end up utilizing a lot of your resources without additional Essence Bursts from your Shattering Stars. From there, we have the class of the Hunter, which is receiving a mixed bag of changes. Beastmaster being the most popular spec in the game right now, seeing a lot of play within Mythic Plus in particular, is receiving roughly an 8% all damage nerf, which was not unexpected. Beastmaster started off with really good performance within both raid testing and dungeon testing, so if you're paying attention to Hunter performance, it was kind of expected. We were planning to see some sort of a Beastmaster nerf at some point. We just didn't know if it'll arrive before the release of 11.1 or after seasonal content has begun. The Marksmanship hasn't seen nearly the same popularity as Beastmastery, so that one's actually getting buffed up by 6%. Also, the talent of Precise Shots, they're trying to make it a little bit cheaper for you to be able to use your procced Arcane Shots and Multi-Shots, reducing the cost from 30% by 40% focus cost reduction, which should help a little bit when it comes to management of your resources and making those Precise Shots a little bit more easier to use and not make the spec feel at times a little bit too focus starved. From there, we get the class of Paladin, with Holy Spec the only one receiving a handful of buffs, and by handful I really just mean one. Holy Paladin healing is being increased by 4%, which I guess is nice. Playing the Holy Paladin recently, I found them to be wanting. Like, I really wanted someone else out of them, because I tried some of the builds that people do play on PTR, which there's not that many Paladins out there on PTR to begin with, so not a lot of talent builds to try out. Trying to make my own builds, it's been kind of mildly successful, but just doesn't quite hit the mark. Would have loved something new for Holy Paladins in general, but yeah. I think a 4% healing buff is fine if you're okay with a Holy Paladin build. I was just kind of expecting something more, but maybe we'll see some kind of a Holy Paladin refresher for a 0.5 update or something. And then we have the class of Priest, and it looks like they're trying to nerf Discipline Priest, specifically when it comes to the interaction with Void Weaver, and even more specifically around the pet of Void Wrath, which can replace your Shadow Fiend or your Mindbender into a much more powerful Void aberration. I guess I was going to say elemental, but it's more of an aberration that deals additional damage to enemies that are super high on health, and ends up being super impactful. So they're trying to kind of nerf the Void Wrath, but for both Disc and Shadow, and they're looking to compensate Shadow through a variety of changes. So the new Void Wrath for both Disc and Shadow is going to have its damage reduced by 35% when you talent him together with Mindbender, because this pet can replace one or the other. This means if you run Void Wrath with a base Shadow Fiend, it's going to be still fairly effective, but you run it with a shorter cooldown, it's not going to be as effective, but will have a 1-minute cooldown. Void Wrath CD is also being reduced down to 3 minutes when you do run it with a Shadow Fiend instead of 2 minutes, so you can't really game it by going with a Shadow Fiend version, because you do also have the Void Summoner, which helps reduce the cooldown of the pet even further. So you can either go for a 30-second cooldown Void Wrath with Mindbender and it's kind of weak, or you can go for a 1.5 minute CD as a Shadow Fiend, and at least it's a little bit more effective. Also, when you do run Void Wrath over, let's say, like Depth of Shadows, Void Wrath is actually going to grant you a slightly weaker version of Shadow Covenant, where base Mindbender is going to grant you the full value version, Shadow Fiend is going to grant you a stronger version, the Void Wrath, because it's a more effective pet, is actually going to grant you a slightly weaker version of Shadow Covenant when you run it as a Mindbender. And also Void Wrath is going to have less mana regen, whereas your Mindbender returns you 0.5% mana, while Void Wrath returns you whereas a Mindbender returns you 0.2% of your mana, while Void Wrath returns you 0.5. They're actually reducing it down to 0.2 as well. And when it comes to the actual play itself, Void Wrath as a pet is very, very effective, and it can do a lot of damage, and the more damage this pet can do, the more healing you can do. As somebody who's been enjoying Disc Priest on the PTR so far, I can see why everybody's playing it, and every time I summon my Void Wrath, I really do feel like my healing goes up by a considerable amount, especially comparing the damage and the healing with Void Wrath up and without it. So that pet is definitely highly effective. So this means this is going to be a significant bit of healing reduction. Technically, I think it does make the Oracle playstyle a little bit better, because you don't have to deal with this weaker version of Void Wrath. You can still run natty Mindbender if you wanted to, but I don't really know if you're gonna go Oracle. Maybe you'll switch up to Depth of Shadows and take normal Mindbender so you can have a better pet, and potentially Shadow Word Death give it a chance to summon a pet for a few seconds, possibly. But with Disc Priest being as strong as it is so far in the PTR, I mean, it was kind of expected that we're going to hit him in one way or another, since they were kind of becoming, again, for second season in a row, the best healer heading into M+, and will likely probably still be very, very good. As for the spec of Shadow, in order to accumulate for the changes to the Void Weaver, they actually want to give Shadow more reason to run Void Weaver. The Void Wrath is also receiving the same amount of nerfs as the Disc Priest one, but they are trying to spice it up and make it a little bit better. First of all, Shadow Priest's all damage is being amped up by 13%. Though the tier set is being downgraded a little bit. So Jackpot that grants you a random proc of Void Bolt is now going to be at 200% rather than 100%, and its proc rate is going to be a little bit less than what it was. The Force set will increase the damage of your Mind Blast and Void Bolt by 10% instead of 15%. So it's a decent bit of reduction for the tier set, which was looking very, very strong heading into Season 2. When you do run Shadow Priest as a Void Weaver to give you more of an incentive to run it, a Void Blast damage is being amped up by 25%. Talents like Inner Quietus are now going to increase the damage of your Shadow Word Pain and Vamp Touch by 35%, up from 25%. And the Capstone of Collapse and Void is also getting its damage increased by 15% to give Shadow Priest more reason to run Void Weaver than sticking hard by Archon. And then we got Rogues with a bunch of buffs, and I told you in my previous video on Rogues, I said it, I knew that we were going to get some kind of tuning buff with a bunch of changes, and this is at least one of them, but I'm expecting probably a little bit more in the future. Couple of things they're doing for rogues. First of all, natively for all 3 specs, I guess not including Outlaw, they're buffing the damage of Rupture by 6%. So this is actually going to be kind of impactful for Assassination and to some degree Subtlety, since there's quite a bit of Rupture-based interaction. But from there, we're going to be kind of jumping all over the place because they buffed up Trickster for Subtlety and Outlaw. And then there's additional Trickster changes based on each spec. But a couple of things they did is to try to make it better. Unseen Blade damage is buffed up by 15%, which is quite significant. Not only does it grant you a damage buff to make the target take more damage, but that additional damage to that primary target, also pretty good. The Talent of Surprising Strikes has also been buffed up by a significant bit. Previously, it would buff up the damage of abilities that generate common points, giving them 25% increased critical strike damage against phase targets. So those abilities, if they crit, hit 25% harder. But now, those common point builders are going to hit 50% harder, which is going to impact Outlaw and Subtlety in different ways. For Subtlety, this makes abilities like Gloom Blade and Shadow Strike obviously potentially better. For Outlaw, things like Pistol Shot, which is a common point builder, that also has a bunch of challenges like an Amp, it makes it better. Ambush makes it much better. And Shadow Strike, it makes it much better. Then with the talent of 1,000 Cuts, they also increase the chance for your auto attacks to reset Unseen Blade and strike again at the target. It's been increased slightly higher. They didn't exactly go by how much higher, but just slightly higher chance for it to proc, which is also good for the playstyle of the Trickster. Backing away from the hero specs, back to the actual class specs, Assassination got further buffs. Crimson Tempest got buffed up by 6%, which seems like a lot, but actually numerically it's not the biggest buff. I mean, it's an AoE buff, which is really nice, but not as big as some may think. Artillery Precision now can hit 7 or 8 targets. In tooltip it says 7, but in the post it says 8. It got upgraded from 5 targets to 8 targets, so your shiv can now strike multiple targets, putting a debuff on them causes them to take additional bleed. While interesting, and you may think, oh, this could have some potentially big impact in AoE, there's some value, but Artillery Precision doesn't even see that much play in Mythic Plus dungeons, unless maybe somebody figures out some kind of a build where you might spec into it. But if you're picking up Artillery Precision, you're probably giving up one of your single target tools, unless you go on some kind of like a cleave build. This one could be interesting, all depends how players use it. Sudden Demise is actually kind of a nice buff, as they're buffing the bleed damage from 10% whenever you pick up the Stallion to 15%. Not the craziest build that's gonna make bleeds shoot up in damage over your Vandoms, but it is a nice, impactful buff either way that's going to increase your overall damage. When it comes to Outlaw, it looks like they sorta kinda noticed that it was behind on AoE and cleave damage because of the way Blade Flurry works. Blade Flurry gives you a hard cap of 8 targets that you can cleave. However, I guess they're trying to make that cleave damage a little bit better if you're hitting less than 8 targets, because with precise cuts, you can now increase the damage of your Blade Flurry by 5 additional % per missing target from your max. So let's say you can hit 8 targets with the talent of Dance of Steel, but you're only hitting 2 targets. So I guess for each target missing out of 8, so like 7 targets, you get a 5% damage buff per, which is kind of nice. It goes up from 4% to 5%, which is okay. So maybe it can give you some really good like 2 target, 3 target cleave situations, which may be good in very certain environments. Also, Outlaw as Trickster on top of all these other Trickster buffs, they also buffed up Nimble Flurry to increase the damage of your Blade Flurry from 20% to 25% more damage. So I guess it does offer you a little bit extra cleave AoE when you pair it together with Trickster. Subtlety saw a 10% damage buff all across the board for all of your abilities, but it also saw a nerf towards your tier set, which was the one thing that was making Subtlety look super strong on paper heading into 11.1. Your 2 set now will buff the damage of your Winning Streak. Now will buff the damage of your finishers of Eviscerate, Secret Technique, and Black Powder by 2% per stack of Winning Streak, down from 3%. So it's a little change, or at least it feels very little, but you're going from potentially 30% damage increase to 20% damage increase. It actually ends up being, it's a decent bit of loss in overall. The 4 set, however, was super exciting, but no, not as much. While Shadow Dance is active, you can't lose your stacks of Winning Streak. You gain additional stacks if you were to gain one, and you deal additional shadow damage per chance of Winning Streak, or per proc of Winning Streak. So it used to be 6% per proc, so up to 60% more damage. Now it's down to 2%, so with full 10 stacks, 20%. It's a lot weaker, and actually a massive nerf towards subtlety. Even the raw damage increase of 10% isn't enough to supplement for these tier set nerfs. Subtlety went from like the go-to spec heading into next season to now a lot of players are not sure. This is a pretty sizable nerf they just took, so it no longer looks good on paper. Maybe with a bit of tuning, it's probably going to be the go-to, or if like the raid environment is set up around a 1.5 milli burst windows that subtlety is really good for, but it doesn't seem like the go-to spec anymore. Actually, Outlaw might even be a little bit better than it at the moment. They did end up buffing up the playstyle of your Trickster with Nimble Flurry, increasing this cleave damage of your single target abilities from 50% normal damage to 60%, but with these nerfs and the tier set adjustments for subtlety, Deathstalker might actually be looking like a better hero spec, which isn't ideal because Trickster kind of does cleave and single target together. Deathstalker has to choose between one or the other, so it kind of puts subtlety in a weirder position going forward if this is going to be your hero spec from here on out. Then we have the Shaman with the Restoration Healer spec receiving a 4% healing buff. Nothing crazy, not really going to change some of the builds going forward into the next tier, but it is a slight increase overall, and I think for the most part it's just going to help improve Restoration a little bit from Raid standing and Mythic Plus standing, but nothing too crazy. But a buff is a buff, and that is something players will take, especially with how popular Disc Priest and Mistweavers are. Basically anybody that isn't those two, especially for M+, is always going to be happy with additional changes. Then we have Spec of Affliction Warlock, which has actually gotten a couple of improvements with Summon Dark Glare adjusted. Summon Dark Glare now does 40% more damage, and each damage over time effect you have against your current target increases the Dark Glare's damage by 45% instead of 25%. This is quite a significant gain for Summon Dark Glare, which with Malevolent Visionary, it increases the damage of the Dark Glare by 70% on top of this buff, and whenever Dark Glare extends dots, it can also deal additional shadow damage to targets, but it definitely improves the effectiveness of Summon Dark Glare whenever this pet is summoned, especially when it comes to their specific damage output. Then there were some single target improvements like Focused Malignancy, which now will cause your Malefic Rapture to deal 40% increased damage to targets with Unstable Affliction, up from 25%. While single target buff technically interacts with your tier set, which has this effect that allows your UA to be split to multiple targets. Hitting Jackpot also causes your Unstable Affliction to be increased by 50% and causes UA to be spread to 3 targets, so this technically gives you, if you get a lot of Jackpots on cleave situations, quite a bit of additional AoE pressure. Also, they wanted to buff the damage of your Unstable Affliction by 30%, though not for PvP. This is a PvE only change, not a PvP change whatsoever. Shadowbolt, the damage of your Shadowbolt has also gone up by 20%, also not for PvP. And the damage of Drain Soul has also gone up by 20%, also not for PvP, which is probably going to make the Soul Harvester playstyle and its Shadowbolt and Nightfall proc playstyle a little bit stronger. And finally, we have the class of Warrior, where both the specs of Arms and Fury are receiving a 5% ability damage nerf all across the board. While this does sound bad, both specs of Arms and Fury saw huge amps over these past few weeks, and like little hot fixes like that didn't even hit the blue post for Fury, with a buff their execute damage by up to 50%. I mean, both specs were tearing it up absolutely all the way through in every single dungeon for a good bit. So at the very least, we saw Warriors doing really good damage, and for them to tone it down a little bit after like weeks upon weeks of buffs may not be the end of the world, but maybe they just saw that they were doing a little bit too much damage. They were having way too much fun, so Blizzard had to tone them down a little bit, as you know. As always though, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also, join our Discord community, the best place to talk about all of the newest changes happening in the patch 11.1. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.